Welcome to Grim Fiction, where darkness meets tranquility. Here, we weave haunting tales set to the soothing sound of rain, perfect for those who crave a touch of the eerie to drift off to sleep. Every night, immerse yourself in new stories that blend the mysterious with the calming, transforming your nights into a journey through the shadows. Subscribe now and let the rain carry you into a world of chilling tales posted daily, just for you. It was supposed to be a weekend of peace. Mark had inherited the cabin from his great-uncle, who died a recluse, leaving behind an isolated property nestled on the far side of Morrow Ridge. Mark barely remembered the old man, but when the deed fell into his hands, he figured, why not use it? The idea was simple: a quick road trip, a few nights surrounded by nothing but wilderness, and maybe a break from the city's suffocating noise. They arrived just as the sun began to dip behind the trees. The last stretch of road was a single-lane dirt path that jostled the car so hard, Jess joked about needing a chiropractor. The joke landed flat. Everyone had started to feel the weight of the forest, too many shadows cast by ancient oaks, too much silence as the road snaked farther from civilization. When the cabin finally appeared, the mood didn't improve. What had once been a modest two-room dwelling was now a lopsided structure with sagging eaves and boarded-up windows. The front door hung slightly ajar, and the paint, once a cheerful green, was now flaking off in gray chunks. "Well," Lila said, hoisting her backpack, "rustic charm." Andrew laughed, but it came out forced. "Sure, authentic frontier living." Mark led the way up the creaking porch steps and gave the door a nudge. It swung open, revealing a stale interior. Dust motes floated in the fading light, and the air carried a damp, sour smell. The cabin's main room was almost bare: a warped wooden table, a few mismatched chairs, and a stone fireplace blackened from decades of soot. "Needs work," Mark admitted, "but it's free, right?" Tom pointed to the far corner, where an old rocking chair stood. "I think your uncle's been waiting for us," he said, nudging Mark in the ribs. "Look at that thing. Spooky as hell." "Knock it off," Jess said. "It's just an old chair." They unpacked quickly, each claiming a sleeping spot in the cramped space. By the time they finished, the sun had vanished, leaving them with nothing but the weak glow of a single lantern. As they sat around the table, eating chips and drinking cheap beer, Lila's gaze kept drifting to the door. The claw marks were faint, but they were unmistakable, long, parallel grooves that ran the length of the wood. "Hey, Mark," she said, interrupting the chatter. "Did you notice these before?" Mark followed her gaze and frowned. "What? Those scratches? Nah, probably just a bear or something. You know how animals can get." Lila wasn't convinced. "Pretty high up for a bear, don't you think?" "Maybe a cougar then." Mark's tone was casual, but his eyes lingered on the marks a second too long. "Whatever it was, it's gone now. Let's just enjoy the weekend." Jess and Andrew tried to lighten the mood with ghost stories. Cheap, cliched stuff about hook-handed maniacs and vanishing hitchhikers. But the cabin's oppressive quiet made every tale feel more plausible. After a while, the jokes stopped, and everyone fell into an uneasy silence. Before they turned in for the night, Lila stood at the door, running her fingers over the scratched wood. She noticed something carved into the frame, half hidden beneath the claw marks. It was just one sentence, its letters thin and uneven as though scratched in haste. "Beware the shadows beneath the ridge." Her stomach tightened, and for a moment she considered showing the others. But she shook her head. It was just an old warning, probably the ramblings of a superstitious relative. They were fine. The cabin was fine. Still, as she crawled into her sleeping bag, she couldn't shake the feeling that something in the forest was watching them. Night fell hard on the ridge. The kind of darkness out here wasn't the gentle, diluted kind you got in the city. It was thick, absolute, the sky above a yawning void punctured only by the cold shimmer of a few stars. The forest, which had seemed intimidating enough during the day, now felt suffocating. Every creak of the cabin walls, every whisper of wind through the trees, seemed amplified, almost intentional. The group sat around the small fireplace, trying to draw warmth and comfort from the flickering flames. Andrew was fiddling with an old, weathered flashlight he'd found on one of the shelves, while Lila traced her fingers over the mysterious phrase she'd found on the doorframe. Jess, still somewhat skeptical about the whole trip, clutched her hoodie tight around her shoulders. "All right, no offense," Tom started, staring into the fire. "But this place has serious creepy movie vibes. I mean, a rundown cabin, strange carvings on the door, shadows in the woods. We're basically ticking every horror trope box here." "Nothing's actually happened," Jess countered. "We're just spooking ourselves. It's just a cabin in the woods. End of story." Mark, who had been unusually quiet, finally spoke up. "My uncle, he wasn't all there, I guess. He lived out here alone for years, barely went into town. I mean, yeah, he wrote some strange letters to my dad, but he was just a hermit. That's it. He's not some horror villain." "So what did he say?" Lila asked. "In those letters?" Mark hesitated. Nothing that made sense. He rambled a lot. Something about hearing voices outside, seeing things in the trees, stuff that didn't add up. Andrew gave a low whistle. "Sounds like he lost it out here. Isolation does that, right?" "Exactly," Jess said. "Old guy alone in the woods starts seeing things. Doesn't mean we're in some haunted cabin." Tom leaned back and grinned. "But admit it, it'd be way cooler if it was haunted." The group laughed, the sound strained, a bit too forced. The fire crackled, and for a moment things felt a little lighter. But then came the sound. Soft at first, almost like the rustle of leaves. Then heavier. Footsteps slow, deliberate, approaching from the direction of the tree line. Lila froze. "Did you hear that?" "Probably just an animal," Mark said quickly, but his voice lacked conviction. He rose, peered out the small window nearest the door, and scanned the darkness. Nothing. Could have been a deer or a raccoon. "That didn't sound like a raccoon," Lila muttered, her fingers clutching the blanket draped over her lap. "Relax," Jess said, though she sounded more annoyed than calm. "Whatever it was, it's gone now." The group tried to brush it off, settling back into their seats, but the mood had changed. The fire, once cozy, now cast long, jittery shadows that seemed to stretch and writhe against the cabin walls. Andrew's flashlight, no matter how much he shook it, wouldn't turn on. He tossed it aside with a muttered curse. A sudden bang shattered the uneasy quiet. It came from the porch, loud, sharp, like something heavy hitting the planks. Everyone jumped, and Mark grabbed the nearest thing that could serve as a weapon, a rusty fire poker. He moved cautiously to the door, while the others stayed close to the fireplace, their eyes wide. "Mark, maybe we shouldn't," Lila started, but Mark had already opened the door a crack. The cool night air rushed in, carrying the damp, earthy smell of the woods. He stepped out, fire poker gripped tightly, and scanned the porch. Nothing. Just the faint creak of the boards under his feet. "What is it?" Jess called from inside. "Nothing here," Mark replied, though his voice carried a nervous edge. He looked around one last time, then stepped back inside and closed the door. Probably just a branch fell or something slammed against the door, cutting him off. This time, the sound was loud enough to rattle the windows. Everyone screamed, and Mark stumbled back. The banging continued, rhythmic and relentless, as if something outside was trying to break through. It stopped as suddenly as it started, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. For a long, breathless moment, no one moved. "I'm sure it's just," Mark began, but Lila interrupted, her voice trembling. "Something's out there. It's not an animal. It's not the wind. Something's out there." "We're all tired," Jess said quickly. "It's late. We're jumpy, that's all. In the morning we'll laugh about this." No one laughed. They all knew, deep down, that whatever was outside wasn't going away with the sunrise. By the time morning arrived, a gray, muted light filtered through the cracks in the boarded-up windows. No one had slept well. Every creak of the floorboards or whisper of wind had sent a fresh jolt of fear through the group. Now, bleary-eyed and tense, they gathered around the old table for a meager breakfast of trail mix and instant coffee. "Okay," Jess said, trying to sound resolute. "It was probably just some wild animal. It couldn't get in, and it's gone now. We're fine. Let's just focus on the rest of the trip." "I'm not so sure it was just an animal," Lila muttered, her spoon tapping against the chipped mug in her hands. She looked out the window toward the forest. "I mean, did you hear how it banged on the door? Like it knew we were inside." Mark shrugged. "The important thing is, it's gone. Let's just stick close to the cabin today and not go looking for trouble." But trouble, it seemed, had already found them. Later that morning, while the group sifted through the cluttered shelves and musty drawers, Andrew stumbled across something odd. A small, tattered rug near the fireplace. Unlike the rest of the cabin's dusty interior, the rug looked recently disturbed. He crouched down and pulled it aside, revealing a square wooden hatch. Guys, I think we've got a basement." Mark frowned. "A basement? My uncle never mentioned anything about a basement." Lila stepped closer, her curiosity overcoming her unease. "What do you think's down there?" "Probably a whole lot of spiders," Tom said, but he didn't sound entirely joking. Jess glanced at Mark. "Are you sure we should open that? I mean, we're already on edge as it is." Mark hesitated. "It's probably just storage, old tools, maybe canned goods or something." "Only one way to find out," Andrew said, gripping the hatch's rusted metal ring and tugging. With a groan, the door swung open, releasing a puff of damp, earthy air. A narrow set of wooden stairs led down into the dark. "Okay, yeah, I don't like this," Jess muttered, taking a step back. But Andrew was already descending, flashlight in hand. "Relax, it's just a basement. I'll take a quick look." Mark followed reluctantly, leaving the others huddled at the top of the stairs. The basement was as dank and oppressive as it smelled. The air was cool and clammy, and the narrow beam of Andrew's flashlight revealed crumbling stone walls and a dirt floor. Against one wall sat a rickety shelf stocked with dusty jars and rusted tools. But what caught their attention was the chest. It was older than the cabin itself, perhaps, and constructed of dark wood, reinforced with tarnished metal bands. A heavy padlock hung from the front, its surface pitted with rust. "Think we should open it?" Andrew asked, his voice low. Mark hesitated. "Maybe. I don't know. It's not ours, technically." Andrew snorted. "Neither's the cabin, if you think about it. Come on, this thing could have something important in it. Maybe it explains why your uncle went off the rails." Mark didn't answer. Instead, he picked up a crowbar lying on the shelf. With a few well-aimed strikes, the brittle lock snapped open. The chest creaked as Andrew lifted the lid, revealing its contents. Stacks of yellowed letters tied with twine, a map drawn on brittle parchment, and a bundle of small, black candles. Beneath these lay a journal, its leather cover cracked with age. Andrew grabbed the journal and flipped through it, his eyes widening. "Holy crap, your uncle was into some seriously weird stuff. Look at these drawings, symbols, diagrams. It's like a cult." Mark's stomach sank. "What does it say?" Andrew squinted at the faded handwriting. "A lot of it's rambling, something about the cairn on the ridge." He kept saying, "Do not disturb the cairn," over and over again. I mean, it's all written in this frantic scrawl. Mark reached for the map. It was rudimentary, showing the cabin's location in relation to Morrow Ridge. A single spot near the ridge was circled in dark ink, labeled simply, "The Cairn." "What's a cairn?" Tom's voice startled them. He'd come halfway down the stairs, curiosity getting the better of him. "A pile of stones," Lila said from the top step. "It's usually a marker, but why would your uncle be so obsessed with it?" Mark's gaze lingered on the circled spot. "I don't know, but I think we should leave it alone." Andrew, however, looked intrigued. "What if it's connected to what happened last night? What if we can figure out why your uncle was so scared?" "That's a bad idea," Jess called from the main floor. "You open the wrong door. You might not like what's on the other side." Andrew laughed, but it was strained. "What's life without a little adventure?" Mark closed the chest and stood. "Look, let's just stay out of the basement for now. We came here to relax, not play detective." As they climbed back upstairs, none of them noticed the faint sound of movement below. Something in the basement shifted, the quiet scrape of stone against stone echoing faintly as the hatch slammed shut above them. The cabin's fragile peace shattered quickly after their descent into the basement. While everyone tried to move on and distract themselves, playing cards, telling half-hearted jokes, and chopping wood for the fire, the air in the cabin seemed heavier, more oppressive. Every sound, no matter how ordinary, felt unnatural. It started with Lila's dream that night. She'd barely closed her eyes when she found herself standing in the forest, the sky a strange, burnt orange color. The trees whispered, their branches curling and moving as if alive. In the distance, she saw the cairn, a loose pile of stones piled higher than she had imagined. A shadow stood beside it, impossibly tall and thin, its arms too long, its face just a smooth, featureless void. It didn't move, but she knew it was watching her. Then it spoke, though the voice wasn't audible so much as felt in her mind. "One stone is missing. You have broken the seal." She woke with a start, drenched in sweat, her heart pounding. The others were still asleep, their breathing soft in the darkness. She told herself it was just a nightmare, but as she lay back down, the whispering from her dream seemed to linger faintly in the corners of the cabin. The next morning, the tension boiled over. "Look at this," Tom said as he pulled up his shirt. 4 red parallel scratches ran down his back, shallow but angry and fresh. "I woke up with these. I didn't do it to myself." "Maybe you rolled over on something," Jess said, though she sounded more nervous than confident. "Yeah, like what?" "A wild animal I let into my sleeping bag," Tom shot back, his voice rising. "It could have been from the basement," Lila offered quietly, still pale from her restless night. "Maybe there's something down there we didn't see, something we disturbed." Mark frowned. "We didn't take anything from the chest. It was just letters and an old map. Nothing valuable, nothing that would." He trailed off, but everyone caught the unspoken thought. Nothing that should have caused this. Andrew shook his head. "It's got to be animals, or maybe even some sharp wood splinter from that decrepit floor. I don't know. We're freaking ourselves out over nothing." "We need to be more careful," Lila said. "Last night, I had this dream. It was like..." Andrew cut her off with a dismissive wave. "We all have bad dreams sometimes. It's this place. It's got us jumpy." "No," she insisted, her voice firm now. "It wasn't just a dream. I saw the cairn. Something's wrong with it. And that thing, it spoke to me." "Thing?" Jess asked, her eyes wide. "I don't know what it was, but it wasn't human." Lila looked at each of them in turn. "What if whatever's out there knows we opened that chest? What if we woke something up?" Andrew scoffed, but his hands fidgeted at his sides. "There's nothing out there except trees and wind. You're just freaked out by this old cabin." Tom glared at him. "And how do you explain these?" He gestured to his scratches again. Andrew had no response, and the group fell into a tense silence. As the day wore on, the cabin's atmosphere grew stranger. The wind outside sounded almost like voices, at times low murmurs that could have been the creak of branches or could have been something else. Lila noticed movement out of the corner of her eye, but every time she turned to look, there was nothing there. Jess heard laughter, high and childish, when she went down to the river to fetch water. It was faint but distinct, just enough to make her run back to the cabin without a full bucket. "All right, this is getting ridiculous," Mark said after she recounted her story. "We need to stick together. No wandering off, no more exploring. We stay inside, we stay safe." Tom snorted. "Yeah, because the scratches I got were definitely from going outside." "Fine," Mark snapped. "You got scratched. Maybe it wasn't from outside. But we're not going to make it worse by splitting up or messing with anything else." Andrew shrugged, though his usual bravado was muted. "Sticking together isn't a bad idea. If someone else gets scratched, at least we'll see it happen." That night they stayed close to the fireplace, their nerves frayed and their conversations scarce. Outside, the forest seemed restless, branches scratching against the windows like clawed hands. Inside, the silence between them grew heavier, as if the cabin itself was holding its breath. Then came the knock, a single, deliberate knock at the door. Not the frantic banging from the night before. This was measured, intentional. Everyone froze. Lila clutched her blanket tightly, and Mark grabbed the fire poker again. "Who the hell would be out here?" Jess whispered, her voice trembling. Mark approached the door, his steps slow and cautious. "If it's some lost hiker or a hunter, we'll just tell them to move on." But when he opened the door, there was no one there. Only darkness, the wind brushing past his face. For a long moment he stood there, staring out into the night. Then he stepped back inside and locked the door. The knock came again, louder this time, deliberate, rhythmic. No one slept after that. The morning came as a pale, watery light that barely filtered through the cabin's grimy windows. Despite the faint glow, the oppressive sense of unease clung to them like a second skin. No one had slept, and the night's unnerving knocks still echoed in their minds. Lila kept glancing toward the door, as if expecting another sound at any moment. Tom sat hunched in the corner, looking at his scratched back in a pocket mirror and muttering under his breath. Andrew paced restlessly. It was Mark who finally broke the silence. "We need to find that cairn." Lila turned toward him sharply. "What? Why? You said yesterday we should leave it alone." "I know what I said," Mark replied, running a hand through his hair. "But if that's what my uncle was so worried about, if that's what he was writing all those warnings about, then maybe it's the key to all of this. Maybe it's why." why everything feels so wrong. You can't seriously be thinking about going out there, Jess said, her voice strained. After last night, after what's been happening, if we don't figure out what's going on, we're just sitting ducks here, Mark shot back. Something's out there, and we have no idea what we're dealing with. If we can figure out why my uncle kept writing about the cairn, maybe we can stop this. Lila hesitated, torn between fear and curiosity. The dream she'd had still lingered in her mind, the cairn, the shadowy figure, the voice that had told her the seal was broken. She hadn't mentioned the part where it had said her name, whispered it like it had always known her. The thought made her stomach tighten, but it also made her feel like they needed to know what they were up against. I'll go with you, she said softly. But we stick together. No one goes off alone. Mark nodded. Agreed. Hold on, Jess said, standing. This is insane. We can't just wander into the woods looking for some pile of rocks. What if we get lost? What if whatever's out there follows us? Tom looked up from his mirror. If something's out there, maybe it's already following us. Maybe it's waiting for us to stay put. I don't know about you, but I'm not interested in sitting here until it breaks down the door. Jess looked at Andrew for support, but he shrugged. Honestly, I just want answers. If the cairn can give us any clue about what's going on, it's worth a shot. Staying here isn't exactly working out for us. Jess threw her hands up. Fine, but if this goes wrong, don't say I didn't warn you. By late morning, they set off, Mark leading with the map they'd found in the basement. It was a rough sketch, the lines shaky and the landmarks vague, but it was all they had. The forest felt different in the daylight, not exactly safer, but less claustrophobic. The tangled branches above let in small shafts of light, and the air was still, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. They trudged through overgrown paths and around dense underbrush, following the map's marked route. It wasn't long before they noticed subtle changes. The trees grew more twisted, their trunks knotted like ancient fists. The ground became uneven, dotted with small, smooth stones that didn't match the surrounding terrain. Even the birds seemed quieter, their songs muted or entirely absent. When they finally saw the cairn, a hush fell over the group. It stood in a clearing surrounded by a ring of skeletal trees, their leafless branches clawing at the sky. The cairn itself was a mound of stones stacked haphazardly, some of them marked with faint, worn symbols. It was taller than they'd imagined, nearly as high as a person, and the air around it felt colder, heavier. The shadows cast by the stones seemed deeper than they should have been, as if the light from the clearing couldn't quite touch them. That's it, Mark said quietly. He took a step closer, and the others followed reluctantly. Up close, they could see that one stone near the top of the cairn was missing. A hollow gap stared back at them, its edges jagged as if the stone had been yanked free. Lila shuddered. It's broken. Andrew looked at her. Broken? You think this pile of rocks is supposed to be whole? Yes, she whispered. I think it's supposed to be a seal, like a lid on a box, and something's gotten out. Mark ran his hand over one of the stones, his expression grim. That explains why my uncle kept writing about it. He knew if this seal broke, something bad would happen. Okay, Tom said nervously, so we know the seal's busted. How do we fix it? Do we just pile some rocks back on top? I don't know, Mark admitted, but we need to find the missing stone. If we put it back, maybe it'll... Before he could finish, a low, faint sound rumbled through the clearing. It wasn't a roar or a growl, but something deeper, almost like the earth itself was moaning. The group froze, their eyes darting around the clearing, but they saw nothing. Jess grabbed Mark's arm. We need to go right now. Mark hesitated, then nodded. All right, we'll come back later, maybe with more supplies, maybe with more light. Let's get out of here. They turned and hurried back the way they'd come. But the entire way back to the cabin, that low, haunting sound seemed to follow them, just beneath the edge of hearing. Something was out there, and it was awake. The group stumbled back into the cabin, breathless and shaken. The journey from the cairn had been short, but it felt like an eternity. Even now, with the door shut and locked, the walls of the cabin seemed frail, barely holding out the oppressive presence of the forest. No one spoke for a long time. They sat scattered around the cabin's cramped living room, each lost in their own thoughts. Tom ran a hand through his hair repeatedly. Jess stared at the floor. Andrew kept fiddling with the edge of the map. and Lila clutched her knees to her chest. The cairn's image was burned into all their minds. Mark broke the silence. "I'm going back out." "What?" Jess shot up from her seat. "Are you out of your mind?" "I have to figure out what's happening," he said, his voice more resolute than they'd ever heard it. "We need that missing stone. If we can find it and put it back, this might all stop." "Mark, no," Lila said, standing. "We barely made it back as it is. We don't even know what's out there." "Exactly, and sitting here won't change that," Mark argued. "I'm going back to the cairn. Maybe we missed something, or maybe we can track where that stone went." "We'll all go together," Andrew offered, though he didn't sound thrilled at the idea. "No," Mark replied. "It's better if I go alone. I can move faster, and we need someone here just in case." "Just in case what?" Jess interrupted, her voice rising. "In case something happens to you, in case whatever's out there comes back here. This is a terrible plan." Mark met her gaze. "I'll be careful. I'll be back by nightfall. Just trust me on this." No one wanted to let him go, but Mark's expression was unwavering. He grabbed a flashlight, the crowbar, and the map, and then he was out the door before anyone could stop him. The hours passed in tense silence. No one could relax, even as the sun dipped lower in the sky. Every sound from the woods, every creak of the cabin set them on edge. Lila checked her watch constantly. Andrew paced, and Jess refused to sit down, her arms crossed as she stood by the window, staring out at the trees. Tom, breaking the heavy quiet, said, "He should have been back by now." "He's probably just being thorough," Andrew replied, though his voice lacked conviction. "I knew we shouldn't have let him go alone," Jess muttered. "He has no idea what he's walking into." Lila stood up suddenly. "We need to find him." "And what if we lose someone else?" Andrew said, stopping his pacing. "What if we all end up out there running in circles?" "We can't just sit here," Lila snapped. "What if he's in trouble? What if—" A sharp sound came from outside. It was faint, distant, but unmistakable. Someone shouting. Everyone froze. "That's him," Jess whispered. "It has to be." Tom grabbed a flashlight, and the group rushed to the door. They hesitated only a moment before stepping outside into the fading light. Mark's voice came again, calling from deep in the woods, strained and desperate. "Help! I'm here! It's—" His words were cut off by a sharp crack like a branch snapping. "Mark!" Lila shouted, her voice echoing. "Mark, where are you?" There was no response, only the rustling of leaves. Andrew raised his flashlight, the beam cutting through the dim forest. "He was calling from that direction," he said, pointing. "We need to go now." Reluctantly, they followed the sound. The forest swallowed them quickly, the trees growing denser as the light faded. They moved as fast as they could, calling Mark's name, but the woods were silent. After what felt like an eternity, they reached a small clearing. It was empty. No sign of Mark. Lila turned in a slow circle, her flashlight's beam trembling. "Mark, where are you? Answer us!" Then they saw it, his flashlight lying on the ground near a gnarled tree. The lens was cracked, the light flickering weakly. Tom picked it up. "It's his. He was here." "Where is he now?" Jess whispered, her voice quivering. "He was calling for help. Where did he go?" Andrew knelt by the flashlight, inspecting the ground. The dirt was disturbed, as if Mark had been dragged. The faint marks led deeper into the woods, toward a darker, more foreboding path. "I don't like this," Andrew said, standing. "Something pulled him away, I think. I think we should go back." "We can't leave him," Lila said, her voice breaking. "We can't just—" "Look," Tom interrupted, pointing to something on the ground. It was Mark's phone. He picked it up and turned on the screen. The camera app was still open. "There's a video," he was recording. Andrew stepped closer. "What's on it?" Tom hesitated, then hit play. The screen showed Mark's face, his expression pale and frantic as he moved through the woods. The camera shifted wildly, showing trees and flashes of darkness. His voice was panicked. "Something's following me. I don't know what it is. I'm trying to get back to the cabin, but it's not letting me." The camera turned, showing only shadowy shapes and brief glimpses of movement. Then Mark's voice rose. "It's coming. Don't look at its face." The video cut off abruptly. Silence fell over the group. Jess was the first to speak. "We have to go back. We can't." A faint, almost imperceptible noise drifted through the trees. It wasn't Mark's voice this time. It was something else, low and guttural, growing closer. The four of them froze, their flashlights shaking as they tried to pinpoint the sound. "Run," Andrew said quietly and then louder. "Run!" They turned and bolted, leaving Mark's phone on the ground. The forest closed in around them, the noise growing louder, more insistent. The shadows seemed alive, twisting and reaching. By the time they burst back into the cabin and slammed the door shut, their lungs burned, and their faces were pale with fear. Mark was gone. The cabin was not the same. It wasn't just Mark's absence that hung in the air like a storm cloud. It was the sense that something had changed. The walls seemed closer, the shadows darker. The structure itself, once merely decrepit, now felt hostile. Even the hearth, which had provided a small measure of comfort, crackled uneasily, throwing warped patterns onto the walls. No one spoke at first. They sat scattered around the room, too exhausted from their panicked flight through the woods to even argue. The firelight flickered over their pale faces, and for a long time, the only sound was the faint creaking of the cabin as the wind pushed against its rickety frame. Finally, Jess broke the silence. We shouldn't have let him go. Lila was sitting by the window, staring out at the darkened forest. She didn't respond. He said he'd be back before nightfall, Jess continued, her voice rising with each word. We should have stopped him. We should have. Stop it, Andrew said sharply. We all let him go. Blaming each other isn't going to bring him back. Bring him back, Jess turned to him, her face tight with panic. How do we even know if he's... Lila interrupted, quiet. She didn't turn from the window, her voice barely more than a whisper. Listen. They fell silent again, straining to hear what had caught her attention. For a moment there was only the wind and the occasional crackle of the fire. Then it came, a soft tapping, faint and rhythmic, somewhere upstairs. The group exchanged uneasy looks. There's no upstairs, Tom said, his voice trembling. It's just this floor and the basement. Maybe it's the wind, Andrew offered, though he didn't sound convinced. Jess stood abruptly. It's not the wind. This place isn't right. It hasn't been since we got here. Before anyone could stop her, she stormed toward the front door. She grabbed her jacket and backpack. I'm not staying another second in this place. I don't care what's out there. I'd rather take my chances in the woods. Jess, wait, Lila said, finally turning away from the window. We don't know what's out there, if we leave now. We're sitting ducks in here, Jess shouted, her voice cracking. Whatever took Mark, whatever's messing with us, it'll get us too if we just sit here. Tom stood, holding up his hands. Calm down, okay? Just give us a minute to think this through. We can figure out a plan. Jess shook her head. You saw what happened when we tried to find Mark. We found his phone and a bunch of drag marks. That's it. Do you really think sitting around here is going to help? Lila reached out to her. Jess, please. Let's wait until it's light out at least. We'll be safer together. Jess hesitated, her hand on the doorknob. For a moment it seemed like she might stay. But then the tapping sound came again, this time closer, more deliberate. Her face paled, and without another word, she yanked open the door and stepped into the night. The others rushed after her, calling her name, but she didn't look back. The darkness swallowed her quickly, her flashlight beam bouncing between the trees before it vanished entirely. Tom closed the door and locked it, breathing heavily. She's crazy! Andrew sat down heavily. She's scared. We all are. But running into the woods at night, that's... He stopped as a loud crash sounded from the kitchen. They all jumped, their eyes darting toward the doorway leading to the tiny kitchen area. The crash had been followed by a dragging sound, as if something heavy was being pulled across the floor. Lila's hand tightened on the chair she was gripping. Stay here, Andrew said. He picked up a heavy iron poker from the fireplace, his knuckles white as he gripped it. Slowly, he stepped toward the kitchen doorway, the others staying close behind. When he rounded the corner, he froze. The kitchen table had been overturned, its legs snapped at odd angles. Plates and utensils were scattered across the floor. The cabinet doors were all open, their contents thrown around the room. And on the far wall, scratched deep into the wood, were 4 words. It's watching you now. Andrew took a step back. What the hell? Tom grabbed his arm. We need to get out of here. There's nowhere to go, Lila said, her voice shaking. Not now, not until morning. But we wait, she insisted. Whatever it is, it wants us to panic. We have to stay together. Reluctantly, they returned to the main room, blocking off the kitchen doorway as best they could. The night stretched on, filled with noises they couldn't explain. Footsteps on the porch, faint whispers near the windows, and that constant, persistent tapping from somewhere just out of reach. No one dared to close their eyes. By dawn, they were still huddled together, their faces pale and their nerves frayed. The cabin was quiet again, but it no longer felt like a refuge. It was a trap, a fragile shell barely keeping something monstrous at bay. And they all knew the truth. They couldn't stay there much longer. The next day's weak sunlight was no comfort. The group moved about the cabin silently, their expressions grim and haunted. No one mentioned Jess or Mark out loud, though their absence hung heavy in the air. The scratched words in the kitchen, "It's watching you now," loomed large in everyone's mind, and no one dared approach that part of the cabin. As night began to creep in again, Lila made a decision. "I think we should try to talk to it," she said, breaking the uneasy silence. Andrew looked up from the broken poker he'd been turning over in his hands. "What are you talking about?" "The thing that's doing this," Lila said. Her voice was low, but it carried a calm determination. "If we can figure out what it wants, what it needs, we might be able to stop it." Tom frowned. "You mean like ask it to leave? What if it just gets mad?" "What's the alternative?" Lila asked. "We can't leave, not without losing someone else. We can't fight it. And if we sit here doing nothing, it's only going to get worse." Andrew rubbed his temples. "This sounds insane. What are you suggesting exactly?" "A seance," Lila said, her tone steady. "We have candles. We can use the journal and the letters we found. My grandmother used to tell me how to do this kind of thing. Reach out to spirits. We can try it." Tom looked around the cabin nervously. "And what if we reach out to something we don't want?" "We've already done that," Lila said, her voice firmer now. "We're already dealing with it. All I'm saying is, let's get some answers before we're all picked off one by one." Andrew hesitated, but finally he nodded. "Fine, let's try it, but if this goes south, we stop immediately." Lila went to work preparing. She found the black candles from the chest in the basement and set them in a circle on the cabin floor. She placed the journal in the center, its pages open to the frantic scrawlings about the cairn and the seal. The others watched her in tense silence, their fear mingling with a faint, reluctant hope. Once everything was in place, Lila knelt at the edge of the circle. The others joined her, their flashlights and any other weapons they had within arm's reach. The room was dim now, the sunlight gone, and the faint flicker of the candles the only source of light. "Everyone stay calm," Lila said, her voice quieter now. "No matter what happens, don't break the circle." Tom swallowed hard. "What's supposed to happen?" "Just listen," Lila said. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and began to chant. At first, it was just murmurs, words that sounded old, foreign, like a long-forgotten language. Her voice grew louder, steadier, as she repeated the phrases over and over again. The candles flickered violently, and the air grew colder. The room seemed to shrink, the walls pressing in. Then the whispers began. At first, it was hard to tell if it was just the wind outside, but the voices grew louder, distinct, overlapping one another. Some sounded like children, others like old men or women. They spoke in fragments, words tumbling over each other. "The seal is broken. They took it. Don't let it out." Andrew shivered. "What the hell?" "Shh!" Lila said sharply, keeping her eyes closed. She continued chanting, her voice stronger now, calling out to whatever presence lingered in the cabin. Finally, one voice rose above the rest, a woman's voice soft and melodic, but filled with sorrow. "You should not have come here." Lila opened her eyes. The candles flared, and a faint shimmer appeared in the center of the circle. It was a figure, translucent and flickering, like an image seen through rippling water. The figure seemed to be a young girl, her long hair floating as if she were underwater. "Who are you?" Lila asked, her voice steady. The figure tilted its head, and its eyes locked onto Lila. "Evelyn," it said. "This was my home. But the others, they used the stones. They bound it here." "What did they bind?" Andrew asked, unable to stay silent any longer. "What's out there?" Evelyn's expression grew darker. "The shadow. It was hungry, so they fed it. When they were gone, they sealed it under the cairn. But you," her gaze moved to each of them in turn, "you let it loose. You moved the stone." Lila's stomach turned. "We didn't mean to." "The shadow is free now," Evelyn said, her voice filled with sorrow. "It will hunt. It will consume. Unless—" "Unless what?" Tom asked, his voice almost breaking. "You must replace the stone," Evelyn said. "Restore the seal before it is too late." How do we find it? Lila asked. Evelyn flickered, her form growing faint. The shadow will guard it. You must be brave. You must act quickly. If the shadow grows stronger, nothing will stop it. The figure shimmered one last time, then vanished. The room fell silent. The candles burned low, and the group stared at the spot where Evelyn had been. Andrew let out a shaky breath. So we find the stone, put it back, and this stops? We hope, Lila said, but Evelyn made it clear it's not going to be easy. Tom looked toward the darkened window, dread etched into his face. If we're going out there, we'd better prepare. That thing's already taken 2 of us. I don't think it's going to let the rest of us off easy. Lila blew out the candles, the last of their weak light snuffed out. The shadows pressed close around them, and the cabin felt colder than ever. It took the rest of the evening to prepare. Each member of the group busied themselves in silence, gathering whatever supplies they could find. A rusted hatchet from the old tool shed, the last few functioning flashlights, a coil of rope that looked like it might fall apart at the first tug. No one said what they were really thinking, that none of it would make a difference. By the time they were ready, the night had fully taken hold. A thin mist crept through the trees, coiling around the trunks and branches. Lila led the way, holding the map in one hand and the journal in the other. Andrew carried a lantern, its dim, uneven light casting long shadows that danced around them as they walked. Tom trailed close behind, gripping the hatchet so tightly his knuckles turned white. Their goal was clear: find the stone. Replace it, seal whatever had been released before it took another one of them. But as they moved deeper into the forest, the cold realization set in that they didn't really know what they were doing. Evelyn's words had been cryptic at best, and the cairn had already proven to be dangerous ground. Still, they pressed on, their breath visible in the chill air. Lila kept her focus on the map, though it was hardly a reliable guide. The roughly sketched paths didn't match the twisted, winding trails they found. And each time they thought they were making progress, the forest seemed to shift, the landmarks changing just enough to disorient them. We should have stayed at the cabin, Tom muttered under his breath, more to himself than anyone else. Andrew shot him a glare. If we stayed there, we'd just be waiting to die. Tom didn't argue, but his eyes darted nervously into the shadows as he walked. I still don't think this is going to work. No one asked you to come, Lila said sharply, her eyes still on the map. You think I want to be out here? Tom snapped back. You think I want to? Quiet! Lila hissed, stopping in her tracks. She held up a hand and the others froze. For a moment the forest was eerily silent. Then they heard it, a faint sound, just ahead. A low, wet, gurgling noise, like something struggling to breathe. Lila swallowed hard, glancing back at the others. Keep your flashlights off, let me look first. She crept forward, the lantern's weak glow barely reaching the source of the sound. When she saw what it was, she stopped cold. Mark, he was lying on the ground, face down, his body unnaturally still. The sound they'd heard was coming from him, or rather, what was left of him. His shirt was torn, his skin pale and waxy, his limbs were twisted, and there were deep gouges along his back, as if something with massive claws had raked him open. But what struck Lila the most was his face. When she turned him over, his eyes stared blankly upward, his mouth frozen in a silent scream of absolute terror. Lila stumbled back, her hand covering her mouth. The others crowded around her, their reactions immediate and visceral. "Oh God," Andrew whispered. "No, no, no, no." Tom turned away, clutching his stomach. What the hell did that?" Leela knelt beside Mark's body, forcing herself to look closer. She noticed something unusual. His hands were still clenched tightly around something. Carefully, she pried his fingers open and found a small object, a stone, dark and smooth, with faint markings etched into its surface. "I think this is it," she said softly, holding it up for the others to see. Andrew's voice shook. "That's the missing stone?" Lila nodded. "It has to be. But if he found it, why didn't he bring it back?" As if in answer, the shadows around them began to shift. "Lila," Tom said urgently, his voice trembling, "we need to leave right now." She looked up and saw what he meant. The mist had thickened, and with it came an unnatural darkness that seemed to crawl along the ground. The gurgling sound grew louder, though Mark's body was motionless. Then the sound changed, morphing into something low and guttural, something that sent a cold spike of fear through their chests. Move, Andrew said, pulling Lila to her feet. Run! They turned and bolted through the forest, the lantern bobbing wildly in Andrew's hand. Lila clutched the stone tightly, her heart pounding as the sound of movement followed them. It wasn't the sound of footsteps, but rather a slithering, scraping noise, as if the shadows themselves were chasing them. Behind them, something let out a long, high-pitched screech, and Tom cried out in panic. "It's right behind us!" "Don't look back," Lila shouted, her voice strained. "Just keep running." They didn't stop until they burst into another small clearing. The noise had stopped. For a moment, all they could hear was their own ragged breathing. Andrew collapsed against a tree, clutching the lantern like a lifeline. Tom dropped to his knees, the hatchet slipping from his hands. "We have the stone," Lila gasped. "We need to get it back to the cairn." "Not tonight," Andrew said, his voice grim. "Not in the dark. We'll never make it." "What choice do we have?" Lila said, her eyes darting toward the surrounding trees. "Mark." Tom's voice was barely a whisper. He had it. He had the stone, and it still got him. Silence fell over the group as they realized the terrible truth. Even if they had the stone, it might not be enough. By the time the group made it back to the cabin, they were barely holding themselves together. Each of them was pale and exhausted, moving as though something heavy were tied to their feet. The stone, dark, smooth, and strangely warm in Lila's pocket, felt like a weight that wasn't entirely physical. They collapsed in the main room, the only sound the crackle of the dwindling fire in the hearth. Tom spoke first, his voice raw. "So what now? We go back out there and put it on the cairn?" "Not until we understand what we're dealing with," Lila said. She retrieved the stone from her pocket, holding it up in the firelight. The faint markings seemed to shimmer, almost pulsing in time with her heartbeat. "This thing is part of the seal, sure, but it's not just a regular rock. You felt it out there. Something is tied to this." "Something that killed Mark," Andrew muttered, his eyes fixed on the floor. Lila ignored him and reached for the journal. "Look, we know the cairn was a seal, and we know it's broken now. Evelyn told us to replace the stone, but she didn't explain why it was removed in the first place. That's the piece we're missing. If we don't know why it was disturbed, we're just patching it up and hoping for the best." Tom frowned. "Do we really need to know why? If putting it back will stop all of this, isn't that enough?" Lila shook her head. "If someone or something moved this stone, what's to stop it from happening again? We need to know the whole story." Reluctantly, the others agreed. Lila laid the journal on the table, flipping through its pages. Her fingers trailed over the frantic handwriting, the strange symbols scrawled in the margins, the lists of dates and names. She had pored over it before, but now she searched with a new urgency. "It's all here," she said after a long silence. "Or at least parts of it. My uncle's notes about the cairn, the cult, the sacrifices. He was trying to figure out what they did, and I think he started to piece it together before he died." "What cult?" Andrew asked. He leaned over the journal, his frown deepening. "What are you talking about?" Lila pointed to one section where her uncle's handwriting was nearly illegible, the letters slanting wildly across the page. "A group lived out here decades ago. They worshipped something. He called it the shadow or the darkness beneath the ridge. It wasn't just some local legend. They were feeding it, sacrificing people to it." Tom sat back, his eyes wide. "That's what Evelyn meant when she said they used the stones to bind it." Lila nodded. "The cairn wasn't just a marker, it was a prison. They trapped it under the ridge using these stones as a seal. And for a while, it worked, but my uncle..." Her voice faltered. "He thought the seal was breaking. He wrote about hearing whispers in the woods, seeing things move in the shadows. He believed the stones were weakening." "Wait," Andrew said, holding up a hand. "If the cult built the cairn and sealed this thing away, why would they remove one of the stones? It doesn't make sense." Lila hesitated, her eyes scanning the pages. "I'm not sure the cult removed it. I think it was someone else. My uncle hinted at someone from town, someone who didn't believe in the old stories. They thought it was all nonsense. He never said who, but he was convinced that they took the stone and left it out there. They thought they were disproving a myth, but they set it free," Andrew finished grimly. "They didn't realize what they were doing." Lila nodded. "And now it's hunting again. The seal isn't just broken, the shadow is growing stronger. The longer we wait, the harder it will be to put it back. Evelyn said it would guard the stone, Tom said softly, like it knows we're trying to stop it. And that's exactly what we have to do, Lila said, her voice firm now. We have to replace the stone, but we need to be prepared. We need to know what we're up against. Prepared? Andrew gave a bitter laugh. Prepared for what? This thing isn't a bear or some animal we can fight off. It's not even human. I know that, Lila snapped. But we can't just go in blind. There's more in these notes. Rituals, symbols. We can use them. Maybe we can weaken it long enough to put the stone back. We just have to be smart about it. Andrew shook his head but didn't argue further. Tom looked at the journal, then at Lila. You really think this will work? It has to, she said quietly. The room fell silent again, save for the occasional pop of the fire. Lila turned the page, her eyes narrowing as she studied a crude drawing of the cairn surrounded by strange markings. She couldn't make sense of all of it, but one thing was clear. Her uncle had died trying to understand the Shadow's prison. He had left these notes as a warning, and now it was up to them to finish what he had started. As she traced her finger along the page, the cabin seemed to grow colder. A faint sound drifted through the walls, something low and distant, like a breath drawn in the dark. Lila didn't look up. She didn't need to. She knew the Shadow was still watching. The next morning, the group gathered around the old wooden table, the journal open between them. Lila had spent the better part of the night piecing together her plan, combing through the disjointed entries and cryptic notes her uncle had left behind. The others watched her warily, each trying to hide their growing dread. They'd seen what had happened to Mark. They'd heard the sounds in the woods. And yet, with the stone finally in their possession, they felt a shred of hope, even if it was fragile and fleeting. So here's what we know, Lila began, her voice steadier than she felt. The cairn is a seal. Each stone is part of that seal, and removing even one weakens it. We put this stone back, and it should close the seal again. Maybe not perfectly, but enough to hold whatever's underneath it. Andrew frowned. That's a lot of should and maybe. How do we know it'll actually work? We don't, Lila admitted, but I've gone through every note, every drawing. This isn't just guesswork. My uncle was close to figuring it out before he died. He even wrote down part of the ritual he thought the cult used. I think we can replicate it. Tom shifted in his seat, his eyes darting toward the dark window. And by ritual, you mean what exactly? Chanting, spells, blood sacrifices? Lila shot him a sharp look. No sacrifices. We're not them. The ritual is about placement, about binding. The words are important, yes, but it's more about intent, restoring the seal with the proper steps, the proper sequence. That's why we need everything to be precise. And what happens if we get it wrong? Andrew asked. What if we screw up and it, I don't know, gets stronger? Lila hesitated. Then we'll fight it, if it comes to that. Fight it? Tom stared at her like she'd lost her mind. You saw what it did to Mark. What chance do we have? We have to try, Lila snapped, because sitting here waiting for it to kill us isn't an option. Silence fell over the group. The fire crackled weakly in the hearth, and outside, the wind whistled through the trees. Finally, Andrew sighed and ran a hand through his hair. All right, what do you need us to do? Lila took a deep breath. I made a list. There are a few key things we need before we head back to the cairn. First, there's an old ritual knife mentioned in one of the notes. My uncle said it was hidden under the bridge that crosses the creek. We need that knife to carve the binding symbols into the stones. Carve the symbols? Andrew's frown deepened. Why can't we just draw them on? Because the shadow feeds on fear and chaos, Lila explained. The carvings are meant to reinforce the seal. My uncle believed the symbols act as a kind of lock. If we just draw them, they won't hold. They need to be etched into the stones permanently. Tom shook his head. And you're sure this knife is even still out there? No, Lila admitted, but we have to look. Without it, we can't complete the ritual. Andrew nodded. Fine. What else? Second, Lila continued, we need herbs. There's a specific plant he mentioned. He called it black sage, though I'm not sure that's its real name. It grows in a clearing near the ridge, where the sun doesn't reach. My uncle wrote that it's necessary to burn it as part of the ritual. The smoke helps bind the shadow, weakens its hold. And what if we can't find it? Tom asked. Then we improvise, Lila said, though she didn't sound confident. If we can't find the exact herb, we'll try something close, but we have to try. Anything else? Andrew asked. Yes, Lila said. The last thing is a safe place to perform the ritual. My uncle believed the cairn itself is the strongest point, the place where the shadow was originally sealed. But that means we have to do it there. We can't just bring the stone back and walk away. We'll need to set everything up around the cairn. Tom groaned. So we're heading straight into its territory. Great. Lila ignored him. The key is timing. Once we start the ritual, we have to see it through. The shadow will try to stop us, but if we keep going, if we get the stone in place and carve the symbols, we can finish it. It'll be dangerous, but it's our best chance. Andrew leaned back in his chair, rubbing his face. This is insane. It's all we've got, Lila said firmly. We gather what we need, we head to the cairn, and we finish this. No more waiting around, no more hiding. Tom looked at her, his fear evident. You better be right about this, Lila. I hope I am, she said quietly. But even if I'm not, at least we'll go down fighting. The room went quiet again, the fire casting flickering shadows on the walls. Each of them knew the plan was risky, but the alternative was certain death. Slowly, reluctantly, they began to prepare for the next step. The forest was alive with movement. It wasn't the usual sounds of nature, no gentle rustling leaves or distant calls of owls. Instead, every creak of a branch, every rustle in the underbrush, felt purposeful, deliberate, as if the woods themselves were watching. Lila, Andrew, and Tom moved as quickly as they dared, their flashlights cutting narrow paths through the heavy mist. Their breaths came short and shallow, their nerves frayed from the knowledge that they were being hunted. Andrew gripped the handle of the ritual knife they'd retrieved from the bridge. It was crude and heavy, the blade tarnished with age, but it felt solid in his hand. Lila had tucked the black sage they'd found into her pack, the scent of it faintly earthy and sharp. Everything was ready. They had what they needed to restore the seal. Now all that remained was reaching the cairn and performing the ritual. But the shadow was close. They all felt it. The air around them seemed to press against their skin, the darkness deeper than it should have been. Several times Andrew caught glimpses of something moving just beyond the edge of the flashlight's beam, something tall and thin, slipping between the trees. He didn't tell the others. He didn't need to. He could tell from the way they kept glancing over their shoulders that they'd seen it too. Almost there, Lila whispered, though her voice was trembling. She clutched the stone in her hand as if it were the only thing tethering her to sanity. Just a little farther. The cairn came into view suddenly, emerging from the mist like a skeletal monument. The clearing around it seemed even more foreboding than before. The skeletal trees leaned inward, their branches gnarled and reaching as though trying to hold the cairn in place. The pile of stones loomed higher than they remembered, its dark surface slick with moisture, and at its heart was the gap where the missing stone belonged, a hollow wound in the seal. Tom stared at it, swallowing hard. This is suicide. It's the only way, Lila said, though her voice lacked the conviction it once had. She stepped into the clearing, her feet dragging as if the earth itself were trying to pull her back. Andrew and Tom followed, their eyes darting to every shadow. The moment they entered the circle of trees, the air grew colder, and a deep, low rumble resonated from beneath the ground. It wasn't a noise they could pinpoint. It was a vibration that rattled their bones, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Hurry, Andrew said, gripping the knife tightly. Let's get this over with. Lila knelt by the cairn and placed the stone into the hollow. It fit perfectly, the markings on its surface aligning with those on the surrounding stones. For a brief moment the rumbling stopped. The air seemed to still, the forest holding its breath. Now, Lila whispered, we start the ritual. She pulled the black sage from her pack, lighting a bundle with a match. The thick, pungent smoke spiraled upward, filling the clearing. Lila began to chant, her voice shaky at first, but growing steadier with each word. The phrases were unfamiliar, the language strange and guttural, yet they flowed from her as if she'd always known them. Andrew moved around the cairn, the ritual knife in hand. He began carving the symbols into the stones, his movements quick and precise. Each cut felt wrong, like the blade was fighting him, but he forced it through. The etchings glowed faintly in the firelight, the symbols pulsing as if alive. Tom stood watch, the hatchet ready in his hands. But he could feel the weight of the shadow pressing in, the darkness growing denser. He heard the faint whispers again, dozens of voices speaking all at once, their words unintelligible but full of malice. His hands shook, his grip on the hatchet unsteady. As Lila's chant rose in volume, the forest seemed to shudder. The ground beneath them trembled, and the rumble returned, louder this time, as if the earth itself was growling in protest. The trees creaked and groaned, their branches twisting unnaturally. The smoke from the sage thickened, wrapping around the cairn like a living thing. And then the shadow appeared. It rose from the ground behind the cairn, a mass of shifting darkness that defied shape or form. It was taller than the trees, its edges constantly moving, its surface writhing as if made of liquid shadow. The air grew impossibly cold, and the whispers turned into a deafening roar. Tom screamed, backing away, "It's here! It's here!" "Keep going," Lila shouted, her voice cracking. "Don't stop!" Andrew gritted his teeth, carving the last symbol into the final stone. The knife slipped in his trembling hand, slicing his palm, but he didn't stop. The blood that fell onto the stone seemed to soak into it, the glow from the carvings flaring brighter. The shadow surged forward, tendrils of darkness reaching for them. Lila stood her ground, her chant becoming a shout, her voice breaking through the roar. The smoke from the sage spiraled toward the shadow, tangling with its limbs, slowing its advance. But it wasn't enough. The shadow pushed closer, its presence overwhelming, its mass looming over the group. Andrew slammed the knife into the ground at the base of the cairn, shouting the final words of the chant. The symbols on the stones flared one last time, and the entire cairn glowed faintly. The shadow recoiled, a deep, guttural scream erupting from its formless mass. The ground shook violently, and the air seemed to split open with the sound. Then, in an instant, the shadow was gone. The clearing fell silent. The glowing symbols faded, leaving the cairn dark and still. The smoke from the sage dissipated, and the forest grew still once more. Lila collapsed to her knees, breathing heavily. Andrew dropped the knife and fell backward, his hands shaking. Tom stood frozen, the hatchet still clutched in his hands. "It's over," Lila said hoarsely. "We did it." For a moment, none of them moved, too stunned to believe it was real. Then, as the first rays of dawn broke through the skeletal trees, they allowed themselves a small, fragile sense of hope. They had done it. The shadow was gone. The forest no longer felt alive with malice. Even the air around the cairn seemed lighter. The oppressive weight that had pressed on them since they arrived finally lifted. For the first time, in what felt like days, they could breathe without fear. They sat around the cairn in stunned silence, too exhausted to move, the faint orange glow of sunrise filtering through the skeletal trees. "Is it really over?" Tom asked, his voice hoarse. He looked at Lila, his hands trembling as he lowered the hatchet he'd clung to for dear life. "It's gone, right?" Lila wiped sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand. "I think so," she whispered, though she didn't sound fully convinced. Her eyes remained fixed on the cairn, as if she were waiting for the stones to move, for the glow to return, for the shadow to surge back out. But they stayed still. The ground beneath them was steady. Andrew leaned against a nearby tree, his hand wrapped tightly around his bleeding palm. "If we actually sealed it, why do I feel like it's not over? Like something's still waiting." "Because you're paranoid," Tom said, though his voice lacked any real strength. "It's over. It's gone. We can leave." But Lila shook her head. "No, not yet." Andrew frowned. "What do you mean? We put the stone back, we carved the symbols, we did the ritual. What else is there?" She hesitated, looking down at the journal in her hands. She had thought they had finished it. But there, at the bottom of the last page her uncle had written on, were 4 words she had missed before. "One life must bind." Her heart sank. She hadn't noticed the line earlier in her frantic attempt to piece the ritual together. She hadn't understood the cost. "What is it?" Andrew asked, noticing her change in expression. Lila held up the journal, her hand shaking. "There's one more step." Tom stood, his face pale. "What are you talking about? We did everything." "No," Lila said. "We sealed it, but the seal isn't stable. My uncle, he wrote this at the end." She pointed to the words. "One life must bind. It's not enough to put the stone back and carve the symbols. The seal needs a sacrifice." "No," Andrew said immediately. "No, we're not doing that." Lila's voice trembled. If we don't, it'll break free again. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but it'll happen, and the next time we might not be able to stop it. Tom backed away from the cairn, his face twisted in anger and fear. This is insane. We already lost Mark and Jess. I'm not losing anyone else. But we don't have a choice, Lila said, her voice rising. This thing, it's not dead. It's contained, but it's not dead. And if we leave without finishing the ritual, it'll come back, and it'll be worse. Andrew gritted his teeth. So what do you suggest, Lila? Huh? We draw straws? We vote? Who gets to be the sacrificial lamb? No one's dying, Tom shouted, but the words felt hollow, even as he said them. Lila closed her eyes, clutching the journal to her chest. There's no other way. Andrew's voice turned cold. How do you know? Maybe he was wrong. Maybe we've done enough. Do you really believe that? Lila shot back, her eyes flashing. You saw what it did. You saw how strong it was. If we don't finish this, we'll just be running for the rest of our lives. Silence fell over the clearing. They stood there, their breath visible in the chilly morning air, none of them daring to look each other in the eye. The weight of what had to be done hung over them, heavy and undeniable. Finally, Andrew stepped forward. He looked at Lila, then at Tom. I'll do it. No, Lila said quickly. It has to be someone, he said, his voice steady. And I'm not going to stand here and let you or Tom die. I'm doing it. Tom shook his head violently. No, man, this isn't right. There's got to be another way. There isn't, Andrew said, his tone firm. We both know that. Lila grabbed his arm. Andrew, please, we can find another way. But Andrew gently pulled his arm free. No, we can't. You know that. I can't just sit by and let this thing kill more people. If my life can stop it, then so be it. Before Lila could protest again, Andrew turned back to the cairn. He knelt before it, placing his hands on the stones. The wind seemed to pick up, swirling through the clearing. The markings on the cairn glowed faintly once more, as if responding to him. Andrew, stop! Tom shouted. He lunged forward, but Lila grabbed him, holding him back. We have to let him do this, she said, tears streaming down her face. No, Tom yelled, struggling against her grip. We can't! Andrew looked back at them one last time, a faint, sad smile on his face. It's okay, I'll keep it sealed. With that, he drew the ritual knife from the ground, whispered a few words Lila couldn't hear, and plunged it into his chest. The reaction was immediate. The cairn glowed brighter than ever, the markings burning like fire. The ground shook, and a deep, resonant hum filled the air. The glow engulfed Andrew, and his body seemed to dissolve into light, his outline flickering before vanishing completely. The rumbling stopped, the wind died down, the clearing was still. Lila and Tom stood frozen, staring at the cairn. The stones were quiet, their glow fading until they looked like ordinary rocks once more. The morning sunlight broke through the mist, casting a soft, golden light on the forest floor. Tom collapsed to his knees, his face buried in his hands. Lila approached the cairn slowly, her legs feeling like lead. She knelt before it, running her hand over the smooth surface where Andrew had been. He was gone, but the seal was strong again. For a long time, neither of them moved. The clearing that had been a battleground just moments ago was now quiet and still. Lila stared at the cairn, her hand still resting on its cool, rough surface. The stones looked ordinary again. No more faint glow, no pulsing light. Just an unassuming pile of rocks in the middle of a forest that finally felt normal. Tom sat a few feet away, his head in his hands, shoulders shaking. His breathing was uneven, and though he wasn't speaking, Lila could hear his quiet sobs. Andrew's absence hung over them like a thick, suffocating fog. The way he had stepped forward so calmly, so deliberately, she couldn't erase the image from her mind. She didn't want to. She owed him that much. We need to leave, Tom said, after what felt like hours, his voice muffled. We need to get out of here. Lila slowly lowered her hand and sat back on her heels. Her voice came out weak but steady. We will, but first we have to make sure it's over. It is over, Tom said, raising his head. His face was pale, tear-streaked, but his eyes were wild with anger. Andrew's gone. He stopped it. You said it yourself. Putting the stone back and completing the ritual would seal it. So it's done, right? Lila didn't answer right away. She wanted to believe him, to tell him it was finished and they could leave. But a small nagging doubt lingered. Her uncle had spent years studying this place, these stones, this shadow, and she'd seen what had happened when the seal was broken. The shadow's power had grown quickly. It had been strong, malicious. Would one sacrifice truly be enough to hold it back forever? We need to watch it for a little longer, Lila said quietly. Just to be sure. If it doesn't show any signs of activity, if it stays quiet, then we'll go. Tom stood, gripping his hatchet like it was the only solid thing left in his world. It's not like I have much choice, but I'm telling you, Lila, if I see so much as one shadow move, I'm done. I'm running. She nodded, knowing she couldn't argue with him. She didn't have the energy to. Instead, she climbed to her feet, brushing dirt from her knees. Her legs felt weak, but she steadied herself, focusing on her breathing. They waited. The sun climbed higher, its light pushing away the mist that had clung to the ground since dawn. The air grew warmer, the forest around them waking up as birds returned to the branches and insects began their buzzing symphony. It was so ordinary, so familiar, that it felt almost jarring. After everything they'd been through, the quiet hum of the natural world seemed surreal. And the cairn stayed silent. The stones sat untouched, unglowing, unmoving. The faint markings that Andrew had carved were barely visible now, fading into the rough surface like they'd always been there. By the time the sun was high overhead, Lila allowed herself a small, hesitant breath of relief. She turned to Tom, who was pacing near the edge of the clearing. "I think we're okay," she said softly. "I think it's holding." Tom stopped pacing, staring at her with disbelief. "You mean we can go?" Lila nodded. "Yeah, we can go." "Thank God," Tom muttered, and he didn't waste another second. He started walking back toward the trail that led to the cabin, his pace brisk and eager. Lila followed, glancing over her shoulder one last time at the cairn. It looked smaller somehow, less menacing in the daylight. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that it would always be watching, always waiting. When they reached the cabin, it was eerily quiet. The door hung slightly ajar, swaying gently in the breeze. Inside, the remains of their supplies were scattered across the floor. The journal still sat on the table, its pages marked with her uncle's desperate scrawls. Lila grabbed it, tucking it under her arm. She didn't want to leave it behind. She wasn't sure why. Tom was already gathering what little they had left, some food, a water bottle, a flashlight with barely any charge. He moved quickly, his movements jerky and impatient. "Let's just go," he said, not looking at her. She didn't argue. With the journal in hand and her own meager belongings packed, she followed him out of the cabin. The air felt different now, lighter, but still heavy with the memories of what had happened. They started down the path that would take them back toward the old dirt road where their car waited, untouched since the day they arrived. Neither of them spoke much as they walked. They were too tired, too worn down. The only sound was their footsteps on the packed earth and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. When the cabin finally disappeared behind them, neither of them looked back. It wasn't until they reached the road that Tom finally broke the silence. "So that's it?" Lila glanced at him. "What do you mean?" "I mean, we're just going to drive away, pretend it never happened." Lila looked down at the journal clutched to her chest. "I don't think I'll ever forget it, but what else can we do? We've done everything we could." Tom nodded slowly, as if he didn't quite believe it. They reached the car, the sight of it jarring after so many days of horror. Lila slid into the passenger seat as Tom started the engine, the familiar hum of the motor filling the silence. As they pulled onto the narrow dirt road, heading back toward civilization, Lila kept her eyes on the trees. She thought about Andrew, about Mark, about Jess, about Evelyn and the cairn, about the shadow that had taken so much from them. And she hoped, prayed that it would stay sealed, that it was really over. But deep down, she wasn't sure it ever truly would be. The town felt like another world after the endless woods and the suffocating fear. The moment Lila and Tom pulled into the first gas station they saw, the hum of normalcy hit them like a tidal wave. The flicker of fluorescent lights, the faint country music playing over cheap speakers, the hum of a soda machine after everything they had endured, these mundane details seemed almost surreal. Tom stayed in the car, gripping the steering wheel, his knuckles white. Lila could see his reflection in the rearview mirror. Hollow eyes, skin pale from exhaustion. He looked like a ghost of himself. She didn't blame him for not wanting to go inside. She wasn't sure she wanted to either, but her legs carried her into the convenience store all the same. The clerk barely glanced up from his phone as she entered. The bell on the door jingled cheerfully, the sound jarring after the silence of the forest. Lila walked to the nearest shelf, grabbed a bottle of water, and carried it to the counter. The cashier scanned it, muttered the price, and didn't seem to notice the way her hands trembled as she handed him a crumpled bill. Back in the car, she twisted the cap off the water and drank deeply. The cool liquid was a stark contrast to the clammy dread she still felt under her skin. Tom finally looked at her, his voice low and hoarse. "Do we tell anyone?" Lila stared out the windshield at the dark highway ahead. "Tell them what? That we went to some haunted cabin in the woods and our friends disappeared because of a giant shadow monster?" Her voice was bitter, laced with frustration and grief. "Who's going to believe that? We can't just pretend this didn't happen," Tom said, his voice breaking. "Mark, Jess, Andrew, I know," Lila said sharply, cutting him off. She took a deep breath, her voice softening. "I know we can't just forget, but if we start talking about it, if we tell people, what good will it do? No one will believe us. They'll think we're crazy." Tom stared at her for a long moment before looking back at the road. His hands tightened on the wheel. "So we just move on?" Lila didn't answer right away. She reached into her bag, pulling out her uncle's journal. The worn leather felt heavy in her hands, the pages marked with his frantic notes, the symbols, the warnings. She opened it, scanning the familiar lines, trying to make sense of what she felt. "No," she said finally. "We don't move on. We learn. We make sure no one else goes out there. We keep it sealed." Tom shook his head. "And if it ever breaks again, then we'll stop it," Lila said, her voice stronger now. "We know what it is. We know what it can do. If it comes back, we'll be ready." Tom let out a bitter laugh. "Yeah, sure, ready." Lila didn't reply. She closed the journal, holding it tightly in her lap. Outside, the night stretched on, the headlights cutting a path through the darkness. They drove in silence, both of them lost in their thoughts. Every so often, Lila would glance at the journal, her fingers tracing the faded lettering on the cover. The road stretched endlessly ahead, but she no longer felt the crushing weight of the shadow's presence. For the first time in days, she felt a faint glimmer of hope, but she knew it wasn't the end. It never truly ended. The seal was in place, the shadow contained for now. She and Tom would carry the weight of what happened, and they would keep watch. If the shadow ever stirred again, they wouldn't hesitate. They'd fight it. They'd seal it. They'd protect anyone else from suffering the same fate. Because now they understood the stakes. They understood the cost, and they wouldn't let it win. As the car sped down the empty highway, Lila clutched the journal, her resolve hardening. Whatever came next, she would be ready.